happened to have made a breakthrough, and it was something that didn't have the importance of my game theory work. I couldn't get a Nobel Prize for it, but it was pure mathematics. I found that manifolds could be represented algebraically. My original idea was to incorporate two-person cooperative games, the whole subject matter, in the thesis.
Yeah.
And then the poker game could have been put there at greater length.
You had one good idea, the equilibrium point.
Yeah, but the two-person cooperative is always more controversial. The equilibrium point, in a sense, is simply a mathematical discovery. Mm-hmm. And such a thing cannot be argued about.
Let me turn to the three proofs that you've given of the equilibrium point existence. The third proof, which I think is the most elegant one, it's kind of a dynamic learning proof in which the players react to what the other people are doing and adjust their strategy, and the fixed points of this transformation are the equilibrium points, and so you can get away with the Brouwer theorem.
It can be interpreted that way, but technically it's just a way of finding a device where something which is not the mapping that you immediately think of, a modified thing, works very well and provides the continuous mapping for which you have a fixed point, and then the fixed point is immediately what you want. There's no limiting process.
I know that Nobel people were very happy when they found out that in your thesis there is the mass interpretation. Can you elucidate a little bit what the interpretations are?
In the poker game example, you have individuals who are playing, but it could be that playing in a certain position of the game is simply a typical person from a certain population. A population could have effectively a population strategy. And this is a natural way for an equilibrium to develop. It doesn't have to be remembered, it doesn't have to be repeated play, but it can be a typical play.
Now, as a prescription, if I have players and I tell them, play this Nash equilibrium, it's self-enforcing because no player can improve on it.
It's not completely enforcing.
Yeah.
I mean, there is an equilibrium,
Yeah.
but, well, if you started to play differently, then other people might react, and then you might do even better.
That's
I mean,
right.
the equilibrium is not necessarily stable.
Like many, many people, I greatly admire your work on embeddings. I wonder if you could tell me how you got started thinking about it.
It was an unknown area, and I didn't realize that, and I said, this doesn't seem so difficult. It should be possible. My intuition was correct. I mean, I had no basis for saying that I could do that, but I did start to work on it.
You were warned off this problem, it's too hard, don't work on it?
I may have been warmed off it, but it would be a natural thing. It's not something that a professor wouldn't give it to his thesis student.
Does your own work make you feel happy? Do you look back on it and say, wow, look what I did?
I'm looking from the point of view of someone who's still working. I hope I can continue to do comparable work.
I think almost everybody's seen A Beautiful Mind by now. And the first title of that movie is incorrect. It says Princeton 1947. And that's when you were supposed to have arrived in Princeton, but you arrived in 1948 I arrived in 1947. And you came as a graduate of Carnegie Tech. And I've always been curious, how did you choose Carnegie Tech?
Oh, there's no mystery there. My family was planning to support my studies at Virginia Tech, or Virginia Polytechnic, and where I would maybe be following my father. He had studied at Texas A&M, which is a much larger place. But it happened that I got into some activity in mathematics just before time for high school. It's like having a project in the science tunnel, but it wasn't a science project. And so I developed a way of calculating formulas more efficiently that would apply to the cable, electric cables between power towers. And my father was writing a paper about that. And this maybe set me up for the attention of Carnegie, and there was a scholarship there called the George Westinghouse Scholarship, which is based on the Westinghouse Company being in Pittsburgh and giving money to Carnegie. So they had a few scholars each year, and somehow I qualified for that. I think there was an exam also, and I was one of the small group that went into that. It was a full scholarship, so that dominated just going to Virginia Tech and paying tuition.
You didn't intend to major in mathematics, though.
No, I was like von Neumann. I was enrolled to study chemical engineering, but I didn't go through to get the chemie degree, though.
How many years did you spend at Carnegie Tech?
It was 3 years. However, it was like 8 semesters, because they had a program where they would have a summer, they trimesters and a summer program. So you need just 2 of those summers and 3 of the years.
Tucker once said when he went to Carnegie Tech to lecture, it was like bringing coals to Newcastle, because they were such a powerful mathematics department. What memories do you have of John Synge or Dick Duffin, who seem to have been people who influenced you to move into mathematics?
Well, those were prominent luminaries there. There were some good people who weren't distinguished so much in publication, but besides them, I think Synge had not been in there very long before I arrived, and he didn't stay there so long either. But I managed to study tensor calculus with him, a very good course, and I learned all the notation that I know, and I've used it subsequently. It's certainly an influential passage of my life. And I took something like quantum mechanics with Duffin. I took a course with him also.
Synge was quite a character physically, wasn't he? Did he wear an eye patch? Or?
Yes, that's it. He had an eye patch. He had one eye missing. I think it was. I think maybe it was the right eye, but I'm not sure now.
No, he moved back and forth between Canada and Ireland and the United States, and he moved around a great deal. There's an interesting connection with your thesis advisor, Al Tucker, that when Synge was at Toronto and taught Al Tucker as a first-year student, he went back to Trinity College, Dublin, after the first year, And he left a note saying there's this very bright young first-year student, Al Tucker, keep an eye on him, and the chairman did. I always thought that Singh was much older than Al, but he was really only 8 years older, and they died in the same year, 1995, the year after your Nobel.
Right.
How about Duffin? He got you interested in quantum mechanics?
Yes, he was a younger person, but I wasn't so interested in quantum mechanics, but the mathematics of that and sort of Hilbert space and some related things. I don't remember very well, though.
If you look at the genealogy project, Duffin has an enormous number of descendants, but many of them come through Raoul Bott, because Raoul Bott was his student. He must have been a graduate student when you were at Carnegie, was he?
Yes, he was. I met him there. At that time, he had a great appreciation of music. He liked to play on the piano, improvising.
Of course, there's another individual from Carnegie Tech, Bart Hoselitz, Austrian economist who was there just for 1 year while you were there. Can you tell me about the course you took with him?
Well, the course was entitled International Economics. And I don't remember it, like I don't have course notes or something. But I think it's very strategic in a sense in influencing my thinking, like particularly my recent thinking. We see all this trouble with the euro. Even it's reached Hungary. People there they were maneuvered into taking out mortgages on their properties in terms of Swiss francs. But if you have a mortgage in dollars, you can expect that the amount of your debt will be reduced by the inflation in the dollar over maybe 15 years. And so you won't really have to pay as much as you borrowed in some sense. But in Swiss francs, these people in Hungary were getting the other effect, because the Hungarians who had borrowed in Hungarian money were getting not so bad, but the debt in Swiss franc was going up because the Hungarian money is going down in relation to the Swiss franc. Well, anyhow, that's near Austria.
Was the course more a monetary trade course or a real trade course? Or did it do both?
I think it was real trade, probably more. That's what I was thinking about when I reached the bargaining problem area.
I think we'll come to the bargaining problem later on, but there is a question. Did you do a report in the course at all?
I don't remember anything like that, no.
Did you ever hear the term game theory even mentioned at Carnegie Tech?
I don't know. I'm not a good witness, and I don't have any course notes.
Well, there were no courses. I think I gave the first course here in Princeton, spring of '52, the first college course in game theory that was given anywhere.
Well, some game theory could be mentioned in a course if not given, but I don't know.
Of course, Shubik learned about game theory by reading the book in the library in Toronto. You didn't have access to the book or anything, the theory of games and economics.
Well, it might have been, there was a good library.
But you didn't read it?
I didn't read it, no, I didn't know. I don't think I knew of it till I reached Princeton.
Well, had you come to Princeton in '47, you wouldn't have heard game theory mentioned at all in the math department here until 48, because Gail Tucker and I started this project on the interaction between linear programming and game theory in the summer of 48. And in the beginning of the school year, we started a seminar in game theory. I think you attended that seminar. What memories do you have of that?
I can't remember precisely, but my memories are perhaps questionable, especially since I went through some shock treatment at a later stage in my life, and I may have lost memories in that process. It's certainly normal. Yes, well, I know I got into game theory through that, and the contact with you and your companions and your Tucker and Morgenstern.
We were both JSK fellows in the year 1948-49. And part of the benefits of being a JSK fellow is you lived at the graduate college. Actually, I had the JSK suite, which was 2 rooms, a bedroom and a living room, and a shared bathroom with an instructor in classics. But you were entitled to live in the graduate college as a JSK fellow too. But I think people living close to you were Shapley and Shubik. Isn't that right?
They were, but there were 2 years I was there.
Yeah.
The first year I was in an odd room very high up, I think it's called Pine Tower. And I think it was the top room in that tower, and you had to go up stairways, and maybe the bathroom was maybe 1 level down from the top level. It was a fairly sizable room, but it was not convenient to go there. And then the next year I was put down on the first floor, and I shared a bathroom with Martin Shubik. So that was a way to get to know him. And Shapley was nearby, but I think he may have had a single room.
Mm-hmm. That would have been 49-50.
Yes, that would have been the second year.
Then you don't remember making any presentations in the seminar at all?
It's likely that I did as soon as I get the equilibrium point idea, but I don't remember it.
Unfortunately, the records are lost for that seminar. It would be nice to have a record of all the presentations that were done there. It was a fascinating seminar. Actually, I think Bourgon talked on fixed point theory there once. Bourgon, I think, was Duffin's thesis advisor. And so you have a line there of Bourgon, Duffin to Bott. And it was a great seminar. The year you were really writing your thesis, Tucker was on leave in Stanford. And I think Sylvia Nasser has written inaccurately that you wrangled with your thesis advisor. I don't think you really had any fights with him at all. And my recollection is, and you can correct it, is that he was urging you to finish it and publish it fast.
He did perhaps want to expedite it, expedite publication. And it came out moderately soon. My original idea was to incorporate 2-person cooperative games, the whole subject matter, in the thesis.
Yeah.
And then the poker game could have been put there at greater length. That became a separate publication, but it was more extensively studied in the separate publication than the reference in my thesis. So I'm not sure how. I remember how Tucker was thinking of the 2-person cooperative games as separated, and that went into econometrica.
Yeah, we'll come to that in a moment. But I think his point was the development of the two-person cooperative games was going to take some more time, and better that you finish it. You had one good idea, the equilibrium point, and add some examples and get it out of the way.
Yeah, but the two-person cooperative is always more controversial.
Yes.
The equilibrium point, in a sense, is simply a mathematical discovery, and such a thing cannot be argued about.
Let me turn to the three proofs that you've given of the equilibrium point existence. There's a proof in your thesis, which is a rather clumsy application of the Brouwer fixed point theorem. There is the proof that you gave in the Proceedings of the National Academy note, which was what David Gale suggested, using the Kakutani fixed point theorem. And then in your paper in the Annals, Non-Cooperative Games, you gave a third proof, which I think is the most elegant one. It's kind of a dynamic learning proof in which the players react to what the other people are doing and adjust their strategy, and the fixed points of this transformation are the equilibrium points, and so you can get away with the Brouwer theorem.
It can be interpreted that way, but technically it's just a way of finding a device where something which is not the mapping that you immediately think of, a modified thing, works very well and provides the continuous mapping for which you use to have a fixed point, and then the fixed point is immediately what you want. There's no limiting process.
And in your thesis, you have to go through an elaborate limiting process to apply it. I've always thought, I prefer the third proof. Actually, the Kakutani theorem is so close to the concept that it's entirely the most natural one.
Well, I didn't realize it at the time, but I discovered recently, only like when I've been back and hung around the New Fine Hall, I discovered that Kakutani was inspired by von Neumann.
I think we've had a dispute about this. I know von Neumann proved the Kakutani theorem first. And I mean, it's a one step. He has a theorem which says if you have correspondences from x to y and y to x, and they're both upper semi-continuous, that is, the graph is closed, and the images are all closed compact convex sets, then there's always a coincidence. That is, there's an x which goes into y, and the y goes into x. And if you choose one of these transformations to be the identity, you've got the Kakutani theorem. And so von Neumann clearly had the Kakutani theorem first.
He had the essential work. Kakutani did a write-up in an organization, but it made it possible so to refer to a definite theorem.
Yes.
And so people have
It's
used it
in
ever
von
since.
Neumann's paper, though. I mean, it said the theorem I just quoted is clearly in there.
Well,
A coincidence.
Kakutani admits that he is inspired by von Neumann. It's in his publication. So I think he's satisfied the ethical requirements.
I would never accuse Kakutani of plagiarism or even attempted plagiarism. He was a deeply ethical guy. He actually sat in the common room at the other end of this hall on Pearl Harbor Day, miserable because he was a Japanese alien in the United States at that time and was sent back to Japan immediately when we entered the war. And so he had to spend the whole time of the war in Japan. Did you know that?
I think maybe I knew that, but maybe forgot about it. Then he soon was back in the U.S.
He came back very soon afterwards. Your thesis has at least two interpretations. And I know that the Nobel people were very happy when they found out that in your thesis there is the mass interpretation. Can you elucidate a little bit what the interpretations are?
In the poker game example, you have individuals who are playing, but it could be that playing in a certain position of the game is simply a typical person from a certain population. And so this is the mass action concept. There's some sort of an encounter, and then there's the first person or the second person, the first person, the second person, the third person. If there's certain positions, then a population could have effectively a population strategy, which they are always doing. It's their behavior, and this is a natural way for an equilibrium to develop. It doesn't have to be remembered, it doesn't have to be repeated play, but it can be a typical play.
You can also interpret mixed strategies as the proportion of the population who play certain pure strategies.
Well, when they have to play, they have to choose alternative pure strategies, then that is the natural description of the behavior, the proportion of the time with one player, one strategy or another strategy. Becomes like the mixed strategy of a player, but it's actually the behavior of the group.
No, as a prescription, if I have players and I tell them, play this Nash equilibrium, it's self-enforcing because no player can improve on it. If they accept my advice, then no player can improve on it. But it's not terribly good as a predictor, is it?
It's not completely enforcing.
Yeah.
I mean, there is an equilibrium,
Yeah.
but, well, if you started to play differently, then other people might react, and then you might do even better.
That's
I mean, the equilibrium is not necessarily stable. A small perturbation is not necessarily forced back in that various things can
This
happen.
means it's not a terribly good predictor in some situation.
If there is a prediction, if you have groups and they do have something that is stable, then it is an equilibrium. But behavior more generally might be more general.
I know as a factual matter, the Nobel Selection Committee was very happy to get a copy of your thesis where the mass interpretation is given. It's not given in the Annals paper at all. How come?
Well, it's human limitations, and also you mentioned that the young Milner was a man of few words.
Yes.
So I could have written more, you know.
Yeah,
I
right.
could have written.
No, I think very possibly you thought of the Annals as a mathematics journal and not appropriate for such interpretations.
Probably a lot of it, yes.
Actually, the first paper you published, I think, was the bargaining problem in Econometrica. Oh, after the proceedings note of your thesis.
Right.
But the first real paper.
Yes, probably the publication date is earlier. Yes.
Now, there's several aspects of that interest me. You cite the names of a number of economists in the introduction to that paper. Have you ever read any of them?
No, there are two papers in
No, the first one, the bargaining
issue
problem.
of Econometrica.
Econometrica.
Well, no, after the bargaining problem, there's the two-person cooperative games and a comparison of treatments of a duopoly situation, where some economists...
That was a different, but the bargaining problem, at the end of the introduction, you mentioned a number of Austrian economists who worked on bargaining. It sounds like Morgenstern providing you with a set of names.
It's possible, and I don't. Now I'd have to see that to be refreshed exactly who was mentioned, and I certainly don't want to say that I had read everything or even one complete book or paper by any name mentioned. I could have had heard by conversation.
Do you have any memory of when that paper was written? Because we had lunch together with Myerson several years ago, and at that luncheon, you said you thought you wrote it after you came to Princeton.
The bargaining problem.
Yes.
I think so. I think the evidence points to that. But I could have been developing it starting with the fall in 1948.
Did
It was submitted in 1949.
I had the memory that you had a paper that you'd sent to von Neumann, and it was the bargaining problem, but that clearly is inaccurate.
No, I guess not.
You must have met von Neumann and Morgenstern through the seminar.
I met Morgenstern around Princeton, but I arranged an interview with von Neumann at the Institute. And when I saw him in his office, and I said, well, I got this result, these equilibrium points. And so.
That extended the Minimax theorem.
Well, I didn't say it exactly like that, but I got this game theory result, and which would applicable to any number of persons. And I was beginning to describe it, and he said, "Did you use a fixed point theorem to prove this?" I said, yes, I used the Bauer fixed point theorem. He didn't say anything additional after that, but what I didn't immediately discover is that he had inspired Kakutani,
right.
and he had used the Bauer fixed point theorem. So it was that was old hat to him in that sense. But he hadn't thought of the non-cooperative gain concept.
Let's go back to the bargaining problem for a moment. It's a beautiful paper, and you adopted an axiomatic form of exposition. That is, you gave 4 very reasonable axioms, invariant under affine transformations, symmetry, Pareto optimal, and independence of irrelevant alternatives, which is the only controversial axiom there.
It's similar to an arrow concept.
Yeah, except that Arrow used it in elections rather than in bargaining. And I think it's more questionable in elections than it is in bargaining. Why did you use the axiomatic form?
People use the axiomatic presentation when they want to sell an idea. It's typically you have some concept, some game evaluation concept, the Shapley value, say. You can present it through axioms. It seems very, very reasonable axioms. There's one of them that has a heavy content when you inspect it. It's a sort of linearity axiom. Then other things can be presented, like the Calais-Marodinsky thing for 2 persons is an alternative to the Nash approach to bargaining. And it has some axioms which the stated it seems a very natural, a monotonicity axiom. But if you examine it, that determines it. And so you could say, well things are like that. You can find, and then the nucleolus can be defined by axioms and other game theoretic concepts.
I think it's an extremely elegant form of presentation, and if you can make the axioms seem reasonable and unassailable, it's the best way of doing it. There's no doubt about it. In your paper on two-person cooperative games, you do it both ways, I think. You first give a kind of dynamic process which leads to the solution. Then you characterize the same solution by an axiomatic process.
Yes, it's just a generalization of the bargaining axioms.
Shubik has mentioned in a memoir that the three of you were trying to solve this problem, let's say roughly in 1950, when 4950, when you were living close by, and you got to the solution first. Do you remember any such competition between the three of you?
You mean Shapley?
Yeah.
Well, no, I don't remember it like that. But he may have been thinking that he was concerned with an objective of that sort, or there may have been some conversations, and I guess he might not have thought of the right axiom or something.
Right.
Shapley value is quite axiomatic.
Yeah, roughly put it, you want to introduce threats in a logical way into the bargaining situation, and then hunt for a non-cooperative solution to the resulting game, right?
Well, it works like that,
Yeah.
Yes. But I'm doing current work that's relating it to that and derived from that.
Yeah.
And it's difficult, or at least computationally difficult.
Let's talk a little bit about a real game that you invented at this same period, which we used to call John or Nash, and when it was commercially produced, it was called Hex by Parker Brothers. You found out later that it had been invented by a Danish mathematician, Piet Hein, sometime before. And I know very well that you invented it independently, because when you first showed it to me, you had the dual game in which instead of having hexagons paving the plane, you had points connected by 6 edges, the dual graph in some sense. And it wasn't later until you formulated it as a board game that it really became interesting to people. There is a marvelous story that von Neumann, this was told me by Tucker. Von Neumann was at the common room at the other end of this hall at tea time, and people were playing Nash on the board at that time. And he walked around and around the table, and he clearly was interested in what they were doing, but he never said a word on that occasion. But that night, Tucker was at a party with him, and von Neumann said, what was that game they were playing in final? And Tucker told him, oh, that's the game that Nash has invented. And he was very intrigued by it, but he wasn't willing to admit he was intrigued by it at the time. Have you followed Hex at all?
Well, I followed a little. For a while it was on some computer sites that you could go on the web and you could play against a robot, or two people might play one another. But now that I haven't been able to see that recently. I think it was a fashion that it dropped out of fashion. It might be one could find it searching hard. And there are some refinements about winning strategies and what can be done. Different size boards, of the rhombus type boards.
I think with an odd number of stones on the edges, there's a good counter strategy for the first player. He can counter on anything that the other guy does.
Yes, I think the first player really has a perfect and simply calculable strategy there, in which he would be patient and would not try to take a very good connection which might appear. Because if the other player resigns, then
When was the two-person cooperative games written?
well,
Was it written at Rand?
I may have been still working on it at Rand. It wasn't really written there. The thing that I really did there was the experimental game.
You were at Rand 3 years, the summer of
summers.
50, summer of 52, and the summer of 54, is that right?
That's right.
So in the summer of 50, there were experimental games, largely run by Flood, I think.
They worked on, they studied some prisoner's dilemma type games,
That's right.
without calling it that.
We can use this occasion to straighten out that story once more. It's very likely that Flood and Drescher had two-person game matrices which were equivalent to the prisoner's dilemma, and that Tucker may have seen those matrices at Rand, but then he constructed the story of the prisoner's dilemma when he gave a lecture to psychologists at Stanford in the spring of 1950. And it's the story that stuck. I mean, if you just had the bare matrices there, no one would give a damn about it. And but they did run experiments there, and there is a story that you disputed. In some sense, it's a criticism of the Nash equilibrium in that players in the long run, over 100 plays, learn how to cooperate and how to avoid using the Nash equilibrium, which is clearly stable in some sense, but there's a much better social outcome if they both agree to adopt it.
Well, that's what I'm working with now. Is how it's three players. They can have an equilibrium of cooperation on the basis of a repeated game, which is not valid for a single game.
Flood actually refers explicitly to your criticism of the experiment, of the fact that it really was not a criticism of the Nash equilibrium, but it was a different game. 100 repetitions of a Nash equilibrium is a bigger game, and in that game there are strategies which can develop on the basis of information that's transmitted through the course of the plays that lead people to cooperate.
Well, if there are finite specified numbers of repetitions, I think that technically the only equilibrium point is the complete lack of cooperation.
You're right.
But if there's a sort of fuzziness, suppose the number of repetitions is not specified. It's different game.
Very different.
Yeah. So you perhaps have the approximation to that when you have many. I think psychologically that's what happens.
We held at Princeton 3 informal conferences on game theory in 51, 53, and 55, in which about 100 participants appeared each time. And even though you'd gone off to MIT, I think you appeared at each of these conferences. Do you have any memories of those or what you did at those?
I had a conversation with Reinhard Zelten, and he said he met me at one of these conferences. That he was there and I was sitting right across from him at a table, but that I seem not to recognize him and not to say anything, and then I didn't remember. Now, what the years were?
There were, well, actually there were four. There was another one in 1961, which you attended as well, because you were living here with Alicia at that time.
That might have been the one.
I think that was the one. You met both Harsanyi and Selton in 61. I don't think he came to any of the others.
Oh.
I think one of the interesting features of those was...
Was Harsanyi there earlier, maybe?
Yeah, it's possible. I think one of the interesting aspects of the informal conferences was that von Neumann came, and I think really was disputing the importance of the equilibrium point and touting the importance of his solution concept.
No, I do think that he tended to defend his own contributions comparatively. I mean, he didn't particularly appreciate, well, in the cooperative theory, it might have been worse, you know.
Yes.
Because they have this solution now called stable sets in the book, which, well, it can't really be called a success.
No, it doesn't even exist for every game, as Lucas proved.
But the area is definitely a problem area, and so they set up this area of study. Shapley Value is in there, and Nucleolus.
Bargaining set, all kinds of solution concepts. Do you have any memories of Gillis at all?
He was a core person.
Yes, he and Shapley independently came across the idea of a core.
Good idea.
Yeah.
And it relates naturally to the von Neumann and Morgenstern solutions.
Yeah. Actually, Donald Gillis went off to Illinois, where he became a computer expert, and I think he discovered one of the Mersenne primes there on the University of Illinois had on their postage cancellation, the biggest prime, and that was fame in his later life. But he was a very important contributor to game theory and independently discovering the idea of a core. When the press published a 60th anniversary volume of von Neumann and Morgenstern, they asked me to do an introduction and Errol Rubinstein to do an afterword. And Errol wrote a very pessimistic afterword, and I can quote from it. He said, "The well of game theory is run dry. There are no more problems of any interest." He also had very pessimistic things to say about its applicability. And we had to send back the afterword to be rewritten, not to be so pessimistic. But it still contains the phrase, "The well of game theory is run dry." I'd like to ask you, what is your opinion of the current state of game theory, what the problems are, whether it is applicable? I'd let you just ramble on what you think about game theory today.
I think each person might have his own reaction in it, and since he's a person who does work or has worked in game theory, so you say, well, the well of ideas, this spring, flowing of ideas in the mind of this writer seems to run dry. But we don't know about the area as a whole. It's like quaternions. That's a mathematical area that was maybe lively for a while. and then it was just a corner, and I think the Hamilton thought it was a great thing when he discovered that everything is true, but it's hard to make much of it. Someone at the Institute for Advanced Study wanted to study quantum theory, but using quaternions instead of complex numbers. It's not wrong, but it's difficult to get a lot of attention and build up a big thing.
So how about your current research?
I'm working on something that does relate to the Nash program, and I have one publication, and there's another publication that's supposed to be coming on experimental work, which was done in Cologne, Germany. And this has to do with the finding an equilibrium for bargaining moves relating to a cooperative game, moves that players can take when in a structured setup, where they can take these moves to enter into cooperation. It was been called also the method of acceptances. I realized at a point, sort of the beginning realization, that persons could enter into cooperation by a process where one can only accept another player, and the other player then might accept a third player. Or well, you might be accepting someone who has already accepted somebody else.
Have you dropped the idea of agents then?
Oh, well, I didn't find a way of using agents that are external to the players, that are separate. I didn't find any good scheme. I thought there might be such. There may be, but I haven't found it. And these players are playing an infinitely repeated type of game, and that game is played non-cooperatively, but when the game is repeated, you see the strategy of the others, you see what they're doing, you see their probabilities of actions. And so you can react to that. And I set up a model where they behave reactively, but the model can be defective. The first one used had some deficiencies, which could be realized in the computation. Now I'm trying to do another one, and I don't know about the ultimate model, but it does suggest that the Shapley value is not right. And on the other hand, in an area where calculations are possible, the nucleolus seem to fit better than the Shapley value. Those differ. So as long as you have two things that can be defined axiomatically, then it becomes clear that the choice of the axioms determines the thing.
What caused you to turn your attention to the problems that you did attack?
Well, some of what I did when I was first there was continuations. Some writing up of game theory things. I think the two-person cooperative games was put in its final form while I was there. And I had something else, which was my alternate thesis at Princeton. I had the idea of an alternate thesis. I happened to have made a breakthrough and it was something that didn't have the importance of my game theory work. I couldn't get a Nobel Prize for it, but it was pure mathematics.
But you could get a PhD for it.
Yes,
if
no, it
need
would
arose.
be
Mhm.
ample for that. I found that manifolds could be represented algebraically.
Yes. So you did that in Princeton. And so you
I
had...
had it originally, but I didn't get it written up until I'd been at MIT, maybe even by the second year.
But it meant that your interest in manifolds didn't start at MIT. It goes back
No.
at least to Princeton. You said you took courses in tensor calculus and so on.
That
Did you
was
know
before
about-
Princeton.
Right. Did you know about manifolds from your Carnegie Tech days? Did they?
Well, the teacher there, Singh,
Yes.
he's also the author of books on relativity.
Yes.
So his tensor calculus was really oriented to doing relativity
Yes.
work and calculations.
So you were aware of and perhaps interested in manifolds already from
Yes,
those days?
and I think I was definitely under the influence not only of von Neumann, but of Einstein and Whitney.
Yes. Now, did you meet them?
Yes, I met them. I met Whitney various times, and I met Einstein once for an interview.
Well, for God's sake, tell us about all of these.
Well, I had some ideas that I studied to some extent after that time, but it was about 49.
Yes.
Einstein had his assistant was Kemeny at that time.
Mm-hmm.
I thought I would get an interview just with Einstein, but when I went there, Kemeny was there. But it might have been a little like a bodyguard, because Einstein had reason to think that some sort of cranks might
Oh, of course.
come in there.
Yeah.
And, well, I had an idea that was a physics idea.
Yes.
It was based on the idea that maybe photons are slowed down in their travel,
Yes.
that the light might lose energy, and I was thinking that the redshift might occur without an expanding universe.
Yes. So what was the reaction of Einstein, and for that matter of Kemeny?
Well, Kemeny's reaction is, I don't think, relevant. He wasn't really a physicist.
Okay, so what was the reaction of Einstein?
Well, he gave me a general philosophical. He said, well, after a while he didn't want to consider it, but he said, well, you'll have to study a long study, and then maybe you will get somewhere.
I see. All right, so that was the interview with Einstein.
Yes.
And then, am I right, after that, then was there further contact with Einstein?
No, but I lived near him for a while in Princeton. See, he lived on Mercer Street at
Right.
the upper point where Eric Maskin has recently been living, and Wilczek lived for a while. And now they'll have to find a new person for the Einstein house.
All right, not our problem. Now, let's see. All right, how about Whitney? Did you have, well, tell us
Well, I
about
didn't finish.
Oh,
I was living at a low point of the Mercer Street,
Yes,
and I was just in a room
yes.
in the house, and I was an instructor. This is my third year, and I was just an instructor at Princeton.
Yes,
But sometimes Einstein would be walking towards the institute. He walked there,
mm-hmm.
and I would be walking towards the university,
Mm-hmm.
and we would walk past one another
Mm-hmm.
on Mercer Street. This happened several times, or frequently.
And was there conversation?
Well, I could say hello, but he met all sorts of people on the street, of course.
I see.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. So Whitney, what were your interactions with Whitney?
Well, Whitney was a very good person on manifolds.
Yes.
And I used the Whitney theorem in the real algebraic manifolds.
Mm-hmm.
I used the idea that you could embed something in 2n dimensions. I did publish a small note, which was not a paper. I published a note called A Path Space and the Stiefel-Whitney Classes.
Yes.
I found that if you consider the space of paths in a manifold which start from a point,
Yes.
that the topological structure of all of these are like the tangent bundle of the manifold. Like you take all the points and then you have maybe geodesic curves through them to some short distance. The space of that is like if you consider all paths.
Yes.
But since considering all paths is a topological concept,
Yes.
whereas considering the geodesic paths is not,
Mm-hmm.
it turns out that things definable from all paths are topologically invariant. Well, the effect was that the Stiefel-Whitney classes could be defined from the paths to points that are geodesics, the space of those.
Mm-hmm.
And that does not appear to be topological invariant, but they have been shown to be topological invariant. So I was saying that this is a way of seeing
I see.
directly that they're topologically invariant.
I see.
Well, this was really out of my main line of studies, and maybe I shouldn't have done it, but I sent this in as a note
Yes.
to the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It's
Yes.
a small publication.
Yes. So, well, maybe you shouldn't have done it. Surely you should have done it, right? It sounds very interesting. I'm sure it is.
Well, but if it weren't perfectly argued, I wonder, I'm not sure that I would accept my reasoning is perfectly solid.
Now.
In retrospect,
So you have mixed feelings about it. The theorem is surely interesting, and maybe.
but it's not just another proof, so it's not the theorem.
Mm-hmm. But the point of view.
Yeah,
Okay.
it doesn't prove a new theorem.
Okay. Before we leave Princeton and return to MIT, tell me about your interactions with Jack Milner.
Well, he had some involvement in game theory,
Yes.
and he was at the Rand Corporation one summer in 1952. At that time, there were the experimental games. I promoted the idea of studying games in coalition games, more or less as described by Von Neumann and Morgenstern, but played by players who were to go through normal human activities. They weren't specified so much what they could do. They could make offers and bids and things. They could do typical types of activities. And there were 4 persons involved in this project. One of them was Milner, one of them was me, and then there was another one was, let's see, now I had the names, but Kalish and Nering, 2 less well-known mathematicians.
So even though you were both at Princeton, you and Jack interacted mainly at that summer at Rand.
Well, that was one time we actually drove out there together. I had a deal with 2 cars, and my sister was going along, and another friend of hers went along. But coming back was different, separate, and I hired a driver to bring the car back.
I'd like to take us back to your leaving Princeton and setting off for MIT. Can you recreate that for us? Why and what did you experience?
Well, of course, I was at Princeton. I had different thoughts about it. I was completing 2 years, and I was told that I could stay on another year, but as an instructor with no special benefits. I mean, and of course Milner was around at that time, and I also had some idea that Princeton seemed to be a sort of very small townish type of thing, and I thought it might be socially interesting in terms of human contacts to be in the larger area of Boston. And so that was attractive. And in the MIT, the Moore instructorship gave a good salary, but with relatively little duties. Like one could have duties of I wasn't very busy as an instructor, and I got a salary comparable to an assistant professor, I think, at that time. And at that time, nobody spoke of tenure track, but lately there's the phrase tenure track is used as a standard concept. Somehow people are in a position they don't have tenure, but they are said they're on the tenure track. Sure. It's sort of a weaker type of contract, I guess. But so I went into that. It was a matter of one of those decisions. I was influenced by Felix Browder also, who had been there, and he sort of recruited me and said it's a good position.
So how did that work? Did he come to Princeton? Did he ask you to come to Boston?
Well, I saw him at Princeton, but I don't know whether he came to Princeton or to see. His father was living in New York, near New York City, I think, and he had studied at Princeton himself, and he had 2 other brothers, and I'm not sure where Bill Browder was at that time, but
I see, but Felix was at MIT.
He had been there. He had moved
there.
on possibly to Chicago at that time.
Yes. So wait, so he was at Chicago, but he tried to persuade you to go to MIT?
Well, I don't think he wasn't an official recruiter, but
Yes.
he told to me, and he said that this position, which he had been in, was a good position. And so that's how I went going there and getting to a position with a significant, well, at that time it seemed like a good salary.
Okay, so then you arrived in Cambridge and set foot in the math department. Do you remember your first impression? Levinson was an important, first-grade mathematician there.
Yes.
But did you have much interaction with Levinson?
Oh yes, one thing, I was on his Office of Naval Research project. He had made a deal that I was considered part-time on that. At that time, that was sort of maybe like the NSF. Money came in, a stream of money would come in. You could get part of your salary from the ONR, and part would from your regular teaching. So I wasn't doing so many hours of teaching. I think I was never teaching more than 6 hours a week.
All right, nowadays I guess that would be considered a heavy load, but presumably in those days it was considered a light load.
Yes, yes.
Like many, many people, I greatly admire your work on embeddings. I wonder if you could tell me how you got started thinking about it.
Well, actually, there was a Professor Warren Ambrose who had been at MIT earlier, and I heard him in a conversation about differential geometry, and the thing came out that the embedding problem for realizing the metric of manifolds had not been solved. It was an unknown area, and I didn't realize that, and I said, this doesn't seem so difficult. It should be possible. My intuition was correct. I mean, I had no basis for saying that I could do that, but I did start to work on it. And after a while, I found that the somewhat singular concept of a C1 isometric embedding was possible.
Right.
And so I wrote that up, and that was something that required at least 2 more dimensions than the manifold itself.
Right.
And later on, a Dutchman, Nicolaas Kuiper, improved on that, needing only 1 more dimension.
Now, can you tell us something about the train of thought that led you to that result? That's a tall order.
I don't know. This is analysis, and this is approximations, and it's an approximation where you ultimately make it perfect. Before you reach perfect approximation, you have smoothing analytic, but then
Sure.
when you get the perfect approximation, it's gone down to C1.
At what point did you believe that C1 embedding is possible?
You could make adjustments affecting a metric. Of course, the method of that, so long as things are smooth, is also used for the smooth embedding.
Yeah.
So that's spiraling functions and things that were used. Kuiper brought it down to a wave-like perturbation instead of a spiraling. So you could make one spiral and then something with a much finer grid.
You worked on the problem, am I right, from your first hearing about it from Ambrose to the publication of the smooth case was a few years, right? Two or 3 years, maybe?
Yes, but the other thing came before, so that gives. I wrote that up and published it before finishing the other thing, the embedding problem. As you call it.
Now, were you sure from the very beginning that embedding must be possible? Did you think that it might be false?
I didn't think that it was false, but it's like one of those things that it might be true, but you can't prove it, like Riemann hypothesis or something. Well, it seemed out of reach, except there was a case where people could work. There was Alexandrov in Russia, A.D. Alexandrov, was working in the special area of 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions. And that's dimension efficient. You maybe have a convex, something that is maybe it could be, well, a 2-dimensional manifold with positive curvature, consistent curvature. You can embed that in 3 dimensions. And he could get some results there. It's restricted to 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions.
You were warned off this problem, it's too hard, don't work on it, or do I have that wrong? Again, it's way before my time.
Well, I mean, I may have been warned off it, but it would be a natural thing. It's not something that a professor wouldn't give it to his thesis student.
At some point, you were convinced that you had the proof. Then, if I understand correctly, the writing down and checking was a painful process. Is that right?
Well, there were some consultations involved.
Yes.
I got into, I think the referee, or the first, or maybe the final referee, was Professor Herbert Federer of Brown University. And he came back with a number of criticisms. He really looked into it. And so there was a job of polishing up and correcting to get up the final thing.
I had the feeling that there's some influence from your exposure to engineering. You speak of a low-pass filter.
Yes,
so I have the
yes.
feeling that you're solving a control problem. You're making the metric
Yes.
converge to the answer,
Yes.
and it's fighting back, but you're controlling it just right, but not too strongly.
And I'm in contact with Levinson
Yes.
at that time, and he maybe had some engineering contacts. Well, of course, MIT is an engineering school. There's something to add about the
Yes.
embedding thing. I had
Yes.
it organized in parts A, B, C, and
Yes.
D.
Yes.
The D was relatively short. It was to extend it to non-compact manifolds.
Yes.
And the work is not very efficient
Yes.
because he multiplied the dimensions by n plus 1,
Mhm.
where n is the dimension in the manifold.
Mhm.
The total number of dimensions to be used was that for a non-compact manifold.
Mhm.
And nothing like that is needed, as Gromov has shown.
I see.
But I wanted to be complete, and I wanted to have something about that.
Sure.
But I outsmarted myself, and someone found an error. Professor Soloway
Yes.
in the West Coast,
Yes.
maybe was he Berkeley or Stanford? He's sort of a logician, but I had an argument. At the end of the argument, one has to avoid self-intersections,
Yes.
using a lot of
Yes.
constructing the manifold is being maneuvered around. There are different portions of them.
Yes.
One portion is embedded one way, another portion another way.
Yes.
But what happened is the argument was not perfect. One portion that is embedded already itself might intersect another portion.
Yes.
So it turns out that you constructed an immersion,
Yes.
but not strictly an embedding.
Yes.
There could be an intersection.
Yes. And so then how did that get fixed?
Well, it hasn't been fixed. That was in the published paper, and it wasn't seen maybe for 30 years or more.
Yes.
And this person brought it to my attention recently. So, well, it's fixed on a web page.
I see.
I say, well, there's a mistake. This is wrong.
Mhm.
This is the fourth part, the whole argument.
Mhm.
But then I observe, well, Gromov achieves that the embedding of non-compact manifolds without additional dimensions.
I see.
So I don't see why I should put a lot of effort to patching up
Mhm.
an argument where I'm
Which has been
using
received.
much excessive number of dimensions.
I'd like to bring in another personality to the discussion, Jürgen Moser, who was very much influenced by your work. Please describe that.
Yes, well, of course, Moser, I met him at MIT.
He was he had a position at
Yes,
MIT.
I think maybe he had married Miss Courant. What was Gertrude? I think it was Gertrude.
Mhm.
Now many years have passed, and he died. But he was at first he was a student or special position at New York University after coming from Germany, and then he had an early position at MIT for a short time. It was later on that this interest in the method used in the embedding problem was developed. There was someone else who had studied that earlier, Jacob T. Schwartz at New York University,
Mm-hmm.
had followed up the implicit function idea, interpreted in that way. And I had been influenced by him also in, well, it's something I did in intermediate time after having been in mental hospitals.
Yes.
But so Moser, and then let's see, the Lax Moser, what's it called?
Well, wait, so there's KAM, Kolmogorov-Arnold?
Kolmogorov, yes. This uses some of the methods that I use for the embedding problem. He called it the implicit function
Yes.
method. I didn't use that term myself.
Right. But so what personal interactions did you have with Moser? Did you explain your ideas to him? Did he simply read your paper? How did he?
I think it was mostly a matter of reading.
I see. So you happened to be in the same place, but you didn't have particularly important conversations.
It wasn't
with
while he
him.
was at MIT. He got interested in that later on, I think, in time.
Mm-hmm.
But that was after I had been in mental hospitals.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was started in 1959.
Oh, I see. So there was actually a long gap between the Nash embedding theorem and the use of implicit function theorems in mechanics.
I don't know exactly how long, but I guess it was some time,
I see.
10 years maybe.
see. It was in the 60s that you got involved in elliptic and parabolic PDE improvement.
Well, it was really in the 50s.
Yes.
I spent 1 year at the Institute. This was 56, 57.
Yes.
And yeah, I think that wasn't published so rapidly. I got involved there, and I think maybe I achieved the breakthrough in the fall term 56.
All right. Can you tell us something about the train of thought there? How did you hear about the problem? What did you
I heard about the problem in New York, NYU, and the elliptic equations, and that in 2 dimensions something was known, but beyond that it wasn't known. And this got interested in me, but I thought in terms of a method which was maybe might reflect back to the embedding work
Yes.
that suggested studying parabolic equations instead of elliptic, and then deriving elliptic as a steady state of a parabolic equation.
You had no particular background in this subject and didn't know a lot of what everybody knew, but that it made no difference at all, that your intuition was, and your thought process was such that it overcame all.
I was using a lot of intuition, but there is, of course, Levinson was around to help me to some extent, and actually, in my paper, I have a reference. Well, there's a direct reference to Stein. He helped me out at one point. And there's something else. Who's that Swedish person?
Carlson?
Carlson. I think he was at MIT at the time I was doing some of this work.
Uh-huh.
And so I think he helped me at some point.
I see.
And yeah, the Stein, I had something that gives an optimal result rather than a result with an undetermined constant.
I see.
Yes, and what is very interesting to me about this work is that I introduced an entropy.
What became of that? That's a wonderful idea.
That's what I wonder, because you see, this entropy enabled me to calculate bounds on the moment of a fundamental solution in this parabolic equation.
I see.
You can control the rate of spreading upper and lower bound.
I see.
And I've heard it said that the entropy used by Hamilton and what's his name?
Perelman?
Perelman
Mm-hmm.
is the Nash entropy.
Oh,
But the Nash entropy originally was in flat space, so you have to make a shift to curved space at least
I see.
to use it. But it may be that it's certainly similar because it's something used to control things.
Oh, I see.
Entropy probably increases.
Of course.
Well, if it's properly defined, and yes, in this case it was possible to do that.
Oh, so I've read and admired much of your work from textbooks, and I see now I should read the original papers.
Well, yeah, there are a lot of things you get a different perspective. I looked up von Neumann's original paper, 1928, on game theory.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot more there that you might think.
Mm.
There's one small thing I could mention, but this is like a lottery ticket or something, a casino bet, a small probability. For some years before there was anything about a Nobel Prize, I was around Princeton, but I was sort of recovered insanity. And I was working away, I worked with computers, and I studied some of the tensor calculus, where I could go back to what had been taught by Singh, and also what I could learn more recently. And I considered again this idea of possibly the light.
Slowing down.
Yes, and at one time I came to the point of view, realized, well, if light slows down and loses energy, if a photon is spreading out, well, ultimately, a light with a zero frequency, if it's all independent of frequency, that means simply the charge, the field of a charge, should slow down.
Yes.
I mean, it should weaken additionally to the 1 over the d squared type of normal field distance weakening. This suggested then, I said, well, this means the field should be something like a Yukawa field, which has 1 over an inverse exponential term in its decrease at large distances.
Yes.
Well, this is usually thought of as very small distances, so you have a meson field inside the space of an atom, it would drop down to nothing. That seemed to have been a successful idea in physics. But I was thinking something maybe very slow, it would decrease. And then I thought of that, and then a little later I thought, well, a gravitational field should be like that also. Consider the field of a gravitating object or a black hole.
Yes.
That should also weaken at extreme distances.
Have you spoken with Dickey, with the physicist Dickey, who had the idea for a long time that the gravitational constant is a field, not simply a constant?
I don't know. I know that Dickey's dead now.
Well, so I guess you can't speak to him anymore, but I wonder if you did.
Yes. And I said, well, now, what would be like a Klein-Gordon equation, but applicable to a gravitational field?
Yes.
We want something that could decrease like that, but only at most extreme distances. Well, this led me into studying some tensor calculus and things, Lagrangians things.
Yes.
Finally, I found it, how one could produce that type of field in terms of an equation.
Yes.
And so I had that, and I thought a little about that, and I wrote up I have a lot of written files that or a lot of computer paper I used to write it on. But then this equation was fourth order,
Yes.
but there were adjustable constants for the second order or the constant thing. Like this is similar to the cosmological constant that can be added to general relativity,
Yes.
which Einstein liked one time, but then
And disliked, and now
turned
they like it
against.
again. Yes.
yeah. Well, now, yes. Well, that's why what I thought about is interesting, because I've got this fourth order thing. I think what this considered by itself was an equation that is scale invariant like general relativity,
Yes.
but it allows for compressible waves.
Yes.
And in gravitation, waves are only transverse, like electromagnetic waves are transverse.
Mhm.
But it seemed natural, maybe you could have compressible waves in gravitation.
Have you thought about proposing an experiment that might test any of the ideas?
Well, the thing is that they may want a certain shape of universe for these new observations, the redshift, the supernovae.
Right.
These three Nobel Prize winners in physics are just concerned with that. And I went to Perlmutter's lecture in the spring of this year,
Yes.
2011.
Yes.
He gave one in physics. Were you
Yes.
there by any chance?
No.
Well, he gave it was interesting, and I got an impression that they were beginning to really want to have the cosmological constant or something
Mhm.
that otherwise they would need dark energy or dark matter and dark energy. And so, well, the idea is, my thing is a little wider than the cosmological constant. This equation, fourth order, is satisfied by any Einstein manifold, anything which satisfies general relativity with a cosmological constant,
Yes.
the vacuum equation
Yes.
with a cosmological constant.
So, wait, I'm sorry. So does it take into account gravity, electromagnetism? Which physical phenomena are modeled by your equation?
No electromagnet, not the unified field
So
theory.
it's a generalization of relativity.
Purely the space-time
Okay.
equation.
Okay. There have been, of course, very delicate experiments that verify general relativity very well. Presumably for you, that means simply that various constants in your theory have to be taken sufficiently large or sufficiently small to be
Well, sufficiently
consistent.
small, yes. Yes, but the cosmological constant would be very small. See, they haven't, experiments do not rule it out, but it's so small that it's undetectable.
Yes.
It doesn't, yes. This would be in that area. I don't know, just a small possibility.
I see.
I'm trying to work out one solution according to this generalized equation that
Yes.
is on my web page. That's called an interesting equation.
Okay. Sounds interesting.
I've been working on a lot of game theory since the time that I was studying that
Yes.
some years back, at least 10 years ago. But I was awakened by this seminar. I see they really want some differences in the space-time.
Yes.
And maybe a cosmological constant, maybe curve from dark matter or dark energy. But this dark energy seems a little desperate-like. It
Yes.
doesn't seem quite so natural. There is dark matter, but it's most in a galaxy. You find there's a lot of dark matter,
Sure.
but you need it out in the intergalactic spaces, and that's gets a difference.
You are still working, but you have this tremendous body of work left to the mathematical community, to the world. I wonder how you think about your own work, about the work that you have done.
I don't know. I think it's sort of like politics. You could say so and so would be a good candidate for president, but is there any chance that so and so could be nominated or much less elected? And things. I don't know. Nothing can be really precisely evaluated.
Does your own work make you feel happy? Do you look back on it and say, wow, look what I did? You can tell us if the answer is yes.
I don't feel about it in that way, but I'm not looking so much. I'm looking from the point of view of someone who's still working.
Yes.
That's sort of like what I might feel if I had stopped working and I could say, this was really good work, but still working, it shifts you a little.
Not, look what I've done, but damn it, I'm stuck, right?
Or, I hope I can continue to do comparable work.
Can you tell us something about the people who have had the greatest influence on you? We've touched on a few of them, but I wonder, I'd like to come back to that.
Well, some of the people, can be at a distance. Like you don't meet the person at all. Einstein was almost like that, but I did manage to meet him. And there are other people, well, they're not necessarily contemporaries, but I read this book, Men of Mathematics, as a child, and so that was sort of inspiring to me at that time. I wasn't thinking I was going to be a mathematician necessarily, but I was sort of a mathematician. That was the area of my exceptionalness compared to other students. And so I found some of those quite inspiring. And, people like Gauss and Riemann are pretty good. And
You think?
Fermat is a colorful figure. I worked out proof for myself the easy Fermat theorem.
Oh yes, I saw that you had written that. Yeah.
You can derive it from simply the multinomial formula.
I will think about it.
It's one way, I think, a generalization of the binomial formula, which is it's a known fact.
To what extent do you think the particular problems that you wound up working on are an accident, and to what extent were they determined by your own personality, your own interests, and the culture of the time?
Well, I think it must have been both. I mean, you don't, there are things that just are not available to you until a certain time. Like, I come along at a certain point, I use a theorem of Whitney. Well, without Whitney, I don't have that, and things are going to be different. And without von Neumann in the book, von Neumann and Morgenstern, the whole concept of game theory, well, you could say, would it have been there? I probably wouldn't have done anything. Most likely, wouldn't think of it without the sort of a prompting atmosphere of the seminar in which Howard Kuhn was participating. and influencing other students at the time, David Gale, and then there was someone called Gillies. And well, Milner was to some extent influenced, because Tucker was doing that, and also he was very involved with Milner, and having discovered Milner in his course.
Let me just ask you how you see your own influence on mathematicians today. Are there particular people whom you, or particular areas where you feel your influence is particularly strong? What would you say about your own influence on
It's quite
mathematics
obvious
today?
in game theory. I get some of the game theory journals, and I see the equilibrium or the non-cooperative, that sort of thing coming up. And otherwise, I'd have to search and go to citations index or this or that.
You might enjoy, for instance, looking at some work that's being done now on the Euler equation of fluids. There are very strange solutions which are constructed by following your train of thought from the C1 embedding.
No, I'm not aware of that, but I did write a paper on fluid motion myself.
Oh, what was it?
Well, I wrote it in print. I wrote it just after I'd been in a mental hospital,
Yes.
and I was temporarily sane,
Yes.
in the sense that I was sort of blanking off possible insanity. I was just accepting life as a worker. I was sort of a low-level worker, but I wasn't burdened with teaching.
Yes.
So I had a year at the Institute. Le problème de Cauchy pour les équations différentielles d'un fluide général.
That's my kind of French. I understood every word. Okay.
That's like this Euler equation. There's maybe a Cauchy problem in that, or the continuing solution. But my idea was not the Euler equation, but the equation with compressibility and viscosity.
Yes.
And my intuition was that this is really more favorable for solution. But there's one disappointment, a philosophical disappointment. When you really think about it, you know that the equations are not correct because they're not relativistic.
Yes.
And I noticed Christodoulou has studied fluid flow under relativistic conditions.
Yes.
But without viscosity.
All right. Even in the non-relativistic setting, the usual terms for viscosity are mere approximations.
Well, viscosity is not so simple. I guess you could have, there's something called Newtonian viscosity and non-Newtonian viscosity. It can be more complicated.
Right. I could be wrong, but I think that on a fundamental level, viscosity just isn't understood. Does that
Yes.
accord with you?
I was working with a simple type of viscosity, and more or less ideal, but with an equation of state. And this paper, in the end, I didn't properly edit it when I got it back from the publisher, so
Yes.
some imperfections are in it, but it's published, it's not much referred to, but
Perfect. Okay, go on.
some people seem to have been influenced in that direction.
I see.
In Japan, but nowadays there's still problems. Well, it's one of the clay problems is
Yes, the Navier-Stokes.
Navier-Stokes, yes.
Right.
And this is where you're referring to work that is sort of in that area? or-
So if the viscosity is zero, then of course you have the Euler equations. One can ask for weak solutions of the Euler equations. They are of great interest because one can imagine them as a model of turbulence, right? So if you have the Navier-Stokes equations with ever smaller viscosity, turbulence sets in. How could one try to understand it? One could think that that in the limit as the viscosity tends to zero, you have a weak solution of the Euler equations. But there are very, very strange weak solutions of the Euler equations. Your ideas on C1 embedding have greatly influenced that. For example, that happens to be something I know about. I mean, your influences all over mathematics.
Well, it's nice to hear that.
What advice would you give for, let's say, a young grad student about to start out in mathematics? What are the directions that strike you as very promising and fundamental?
I don't have advice for that, partly because I haven't been advising graduate students.
Mm-hmm.
But if someone did ask me, well, mathematics is not one fashion. There are fashions, but the fashions are shifting, and at any time there's more than one fashion that is in vogue, and so you have alternatives. There's always some analysis, some algebra, maybe topology, then different ways of saying what the main things are. This will probably change in time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's a little like gambling. You know, you go into the casino, what numbers on the wheel is sending, what numbers should you bet on?
But of course, let's say, just to pick something not quite at random, when you heard about the embedding problem, you had a gut feeling which led you to think to yourself, I will work on this.
I did have it in that case. Somehow I intuited correctly that I could prove it.
Mm-hmm.
But how did this come about? It's hard to say. Well, I think it wasn't quite considered analysis. Analysis was what is needed, but it seemed to be geometry. The differential geometers were working more formally. They're working with symbols, and they would do maybe some topology and other things, anything but analysis. Mm-hmm. But in analysis, the problem was not insurmountable. And then, of course, this Poincaré thing is an example where methods of analysis are being used to prove a geometrical result.
Well, as an analyst, I thoroughly approve of what you just said.
Of course, I do think that one needs to argue and make sure that the proof is really a proof with all the I's dotted.